Hello, everyone. I hope you are having a calm and comfortable moment today. Take a slow breath and allow yourself to relax naturally. Have you ever noticed how some people use English without seeming to think about it very much? Not because they are showing off, not because they are trying to sound fluent, but because English simply feels natural to them, comfortable, familiar, almost like part of their instincts. And maybe you wondered something important. How does a language reach that point? How does English stop feeling like something difficult and become something natural? Because at the beginning, English feels very conscious. Every sentence requires effort. Every conversation requires concentration. You think carefully before speaking. You monitor your grammar constantly. You search for vocabulary mentally. And because of this, communication feels heavy sometimes. But over time, something begins changing quietly. Not suddenly, not dramatically, slowly, little by little. English begins moving more naturally through the mind. Simple reactions appear automatically. Common expressions feel familiar. You begin understanding emotional tone immediately. And one day, you realize something surprising. You are no longer actively trying to use English all the time. Sometimes it simply appears naturally. And this is an important turning point, because this is the moment English begins becoming your second nature. Another important idea is automatic familiarity. At first, English feels unfamiliar to the brain, so everything requires conscious effort. But repeated exposure changes this slowly. The brain begins recognizing patterns automatically, and familiar patterns require less energy. Another key point is emotional comfort. Second nature does not come only from memorization. It comes from emotional familiarity, feeling safe inside the language, relaxed during conversations, comfortable making mistakes sometimes. And this emotional comfort changes fluency deeply. Another important idea is reduced self-monitoring. Many learners constantly watch themselves while speaking. Am I correct? Did I say that properly? Do I sound natural enough? But fluent speakers often focus more on communication itself, on ideas, on emotion, on interaction. And because of this, their speaking feels lighter and more natural. Let me share a simple example. A learner studies English for many years. At first, every conversation feels stressful. They prepare mentally before speaking. They analyze their mistakes afterward, and communication feels exhausting. But after years of natural exposure and repeated interaction, something changes slowly. They begin responding automatically in conversations. Simple phrases appear naturally. Emotional reactions happen immediately, and they stop translating constantly inside their minds. This is no longer only studied English. It is becoming instinctive communication. Another example. Two learners hear the phrase, "That sounds good." The first learner processes it academically. Vocabulary, grammar, meaning. The second learner feels the meaning instantly and emotionally. The response feels natural, almost automatic. This difference is deeper than vocabulary knowledge. It is familiarity built through repeated experience. Another important idea is coexistence between languages. When English becomes your second nature, it no longer feels like a competing system inside your mind. It becomes another natural space for thought and communication, not replacing your first language, but existing beside it comfortably. Another key point is identity expansion. At first, many learners feel emotionally smaller in English. more careful, more limited. But when English becomes familiar enough, personality begins appearing naturally again. Humor, warmth, curiosity, confidence, and communication begins feeling more human. At this point, you may begin noticing something clearly. Becoming fluent is not only about speaking faster, it is about reaching the point where English begins feeling emotionally natural inside the mind itself. But there is still something important we need to understand. How does English slowly become automatic over time? Why do some learners eventually feel natural comfort in English, while others remain mentally tense for years? And how can you slowly help English become part of your instincts naturally? And this is where the story begins to go deeper. From conscious English to instinctive English. Now that we understand that English slowly becomes emotionally familiar over time, we can begin to explore how the language gradually turns into something instinctive and natural. The goal is not to force automatic fluency immediately. The goal is to reduce mental resistance little by little, until English begins flowing more naturally on its own. The first step is repeated natural exposure. Second nature develops through repetition, not stressful repetition, natural repetition. Hearing similar expressions again and again, listening to emotional tone repeatedly, experiencing conversations naturally over time. The brain slowly stops treating English as something unfamiliar, and familiar things begin feeling automatic. The second step is emotional relaxation during communication. Many learners still feel emotionally tense while speaking English. They fear mistakes, silence, judgment. But instinctive communication grows when the mind becomes calmer. Relaxed minds process language more naturally. This is why emotional comfort matters so much. The third step is reducing conscious control. At first, learners try controlling every sentence carefully. Grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, everything feels monitored constantly. But when English becomes your second nature, communication becomes less controlled and more responsive. You react naturally. You adjust automatically. You continue without overthinking every detail. The fourth step is direct emotional understanding. At first, English often passes through translation first, but later, meaning begins arriving emotionally and instantly. A phrase feels funny immediately. A sentence feels warm naturally. An emotional reaction appears before conscious translation. And this is a major transformation. Let me share a simple example. A learner watches English videos every day for several years. At first, everything requires concentration. They pause frequently, translate internally, become mentally tired quickly. But after long exposure, something changes quietly. They begin understanding emotional tone instantly. They react naturally to conversations. They even predict expressions automatically sometimes. And eventually, English begins feeling less like input and more like natural experience. Another example. Two learners join a casual conversation. The first learner carefully prepares each sentence mentally. Their speaking feels controlled and slow. The second learner reacts more naturally. Not perfectly, but comfortably. Simple expressions appear automatically. Emotional reactions feel immediate. And because of this, their English feels more alive. Another important idea is body-level familiarity. When something becomes second nature, it no longer feels fully intellectual. It becomes physical almost. Natural timing, natural reactions, natural rhythm. Like riding a bicycle after years of practice, English begins feeling less like constructed language and more like instinctive movement inside communication. The fifth step is allowing your personality to exist fully in English. At first, many learners become emotionally smaller in English conversations, careful, quiet, restricted. But when English becomes familiar enough, real personality begins appearing naturally again. Humor, emotion, warmth, curiosity, and communication becomes deeply human. The sixth step is comfort with imperfection. Second nature does not require perfection. Fluent speakers still pause sometimes, forget words occasionally, restart sentences naturally, but they continue comfortably anyway. This emotional freedom protects conversational flow. The seventh step is internal coexistence. At first, English may feel like a separate mental system, something outside your natural thinking process. But over time, English begins existing beside your first language naturally and peacefully, without conflict, without constant translation, without emotional resistance. The eighth step is identity expansion. When English becomes your second nature, you do not become a different person. Instead, your ability to think, feel, and communicate expands into another language naturally. Another important idea is subconscious prediction. Fluent speakers often predict language automatically. Common phrases, conversation rhythm, emotional patterns. And this automatic prediction reduces mental effort dramatically. Another key point is trust. Instinctive communication grows when learners trust themselves more. Trust simple English. Trust natural reactions. Trust continuation instead of perfection. And this trust creates smoother communication. Another important idea is patience. Second nature develops quietly over years of repeated emotional experience, not through force, not through pressure, but through familiarity slowly becoming instinctive. At this point, you may begin noticing something different. English no longer feels completely separate from your natural thoughts and reactions. It begins feeling closer, lighter, more automatic, almost like another part of yourself. But there is still one important part left. What happens emotionally? When English finally becomes part of your instincts completely, what does it truly feel like? To communicate naturally without fighting the language internally anymore? And how does this quiet transformation change the experience of life itself? And this is where the story moves forward. From familiar English to instinctive English. So now we come to the final part of this story. What does it truly feel like when English becomes part of your instincts naturally? Because this transformation is not only about fluency, it is not only about speaking quickly, it is something much quieter than that. A deep feeling of naturalness inside the language itself. Many learners spend years fighting English internally, thinking carefully before every sentence, monitoring every mistake, feeling tension during conversations. And because of this, English continues feeling heavy emotionally. But eventually, for some people, that internal struggle begins to disappear slowly. Not perfectly, not completely overnight, but enough for communication to begin feeling natural. And this changes everything. The first step in this final transformation is trust in your own communication. At first, many learners do not trust themselves while speaking English. They depend on perfect grammar, perfect preparation, perfect control. But instinctive English grows When learners begin trusting natural communication itself, simple words, natural reactions, imperfect but real conversations, and this trust reduces mental pressure deeply. The second step is emotional freedom during conversations. When English becomes your second nature, you stop fearing every small imperfection. You allow pauses naturally. You restart sentences comfortably. You continue speaking without panic. And because of this, conversations feel emotionally lighter. The third step is spontaneous reaction. One day, you hear English and respond emotionally immediately, not through translation, not through analysis, but through instinctive understanding. A joke feels funny instantly. A story feels emotional naturally. A phrase creates warmth immediately. And in those moments, English stops feeling like something separate from experience itself. The fourth step is relaxed presence. At first, many learners remain mentally outside conversations, watching themselves constantly. But later, attention shifts into communication itself, into emotion, into connection, into the moment. And this creates natural conversational flow. Let me share a simple example. A learner travels abroad after many years of studying English. At first, daily interactions feel exhausting. Every conversation requires concentration. Every response feels deliberate. But after months of repeated communication, something changes quietly. Ordering food feels automatic. Small talk feels natural. Jokes become understandable instantly. And one day, during a casual conversation with friends, they suddenly realize something surprising. They are no longer thinking about English constantly. They are simply living inside the conversation. And this realization feels deeply peaceful. Another example. Two learners continue improving for years. The first learner remains focused mainly on correctness. English becomes technically strong, but emotionally tense. The second learner focuses on communication, experience, and emotional familiarity. And slowly, English begins feeling like a natural extension of thought itself. This creates instinctive fluency. The fifth step is identity comfort. When English becomes your second nature, you stop feeling emotionally smaller inside the language. Your personality appears naturally. Humor, kindness, emotion, confidence, curiosity, and communication begins feeling fully human again. The sixth step is coexistence without resistance. Your first language and English stop competing emotionally. English no longer feels invasive or unnatural. It simply becomes another familiar space for thought and communication. And this coexistence creates inner calm. The seventh step is subconscious fluency. Many parts of communication begin happening automatically. Predicting phrases, understanding tone, choosing common expressions naturally. And because of this, English requires less conscious effort over time. The eighth step is emotional belonging. This may be the deepest transformation of all. At first, English feels like a place you visit temporarily, but eventually, it begins feeling like somewhere you can exist comfortably. Not perfectly, but naturally. And this emotional belonging changes your relationship with the language forever. Another important idea is patience. Second nature cannot be rushed. It develops through years of repeated emotional experience, conversations, stories, thoughts, quiet moments of familiarity growing slowly over time. Another key point is gentleness. People often force fluency too aggressively, But instinctive communication grows more naturally when the mind feels relaxed and emotionally safe. Another important idea is presence without fear. Fluent speakers are not constantly fighting the language internally anymore. They trust communication enough to stay emotionally present inside it. And this creates natural flow. Over time, something beautiful begins to happen. English stops feeling like something you must manage carefully. It becomes another natural way to experience life itself, another way to connect, another way to think, another way to feel. And in that moment, you realize something important. The final stage of fluency is not perfect English. It is natural belonging inside the language itself. The quiet moment. When English becomes part of your instincts, your emotions, and your everyday experience naturally. And this is what it truly means. For English to become your second nature. So if you remember one thing from this story, remember this. Do not force fluency aggressively. Live with English gently. Trust simple communication. And allow familiarity to become instinct naturally over time. Thank you for spending this time with the story. And as always, see you in the next story.